Yeah, g'day all, how you going? Been having a look through the VEAC draft recommendations and all of the supporting documentation, and I've come up with a fairly sizable omission in their recommendation, all the supporting documentation that they've put forward, which is actually goes against the actual Act. Just want to go through a couple of things with you guys. And hopefully this will help you with your submissions, because it is quite a simple bit that they are just not doing. So if I read the purpose of going through this assessment is to identify and evaluate the condition, natural and biodiversity values and cultural, social and economic values and the current uses of public land. And the second one is to make recommendations the balanced use and appropriate management arrangements to conserve and enhance the natural and cultural values. Now, if you read through the draft recommendations, it's probably about 90% about natural and cultural values, which, fair enough, you can go through that. And even if you look at the actual draft recommendations, they actually forget about the original purpose of it, which is around which also includes the social and the economic values, and basically says that the framework to cater for increasing recreational use, well, that's obviously not happening now that you're shutting areas, especially for, I'll speak for the prospectors if you like, in a way that minimises conflict between users and protects the natural values on which they depend. Again, nothing about the fact that it's destroying the communities that are living around there. And why this is important is because the VEAC, within the Act, if you look at Section 18 of the Act, basically says, I'll read this to you, the potential environmental, social and economic consequences of implementing the proposed recommendations. Now, they haven't done that. So, in a simple way, if we could get at least 100 people to basically say the draft recommendations fail to meet Section 18 of the VEAC Act, which because the potential environmental, social and economic consequences of the proposed recommendations are not measured. It's as simple as that. I'll put some wording at the end when we go through it, because the only thing that they've done in terms of socio-economic is actually just, I think it was Gillespie Economics. They did a socio-economic profile, which is basically using census data to say, in this area we have X amount of people that live at this sort of level and they were born in Australia and so forth. That is not an evaluation of the decision and the recommendations that they're putting forward. Okay, so in terms of, yes, they can actually physically do this measurement of the, they've done a fair amount of work on the environmental, at least the background of it. Of course, they could do a hell of a lot more, because all the bush users that are in there have probably seen more of it than a couple of scientists that may do a study in there every 5 or 10 years. But there's a number of ways. So you probably would have heard of a lot of large projects talk about net community benefit and all that kind of stuff. So that's on the back of an evaluation of both the social, environmental, and economic impact of basically what's been put forward, whether that be a project. In some ways, you can consider this to be a project, because they're basically changing the land use of certain areas. So yes, there are mechanisms they can use. You could even use stuff like social return on investment, which is another way of actually interviewing people, getting people to understand what's that decision worth to you. How does that impact you on your daily life? So there's a lot of stuff that they can actually physically done that just has not been done. So, and it also has an impact on what they're trying to evaluate, which is basically the natural capital of these areas. So natural capital also means of how the actual the environment values not only connecting, if you like, the biodiversity, but also how it interacts with the community around it. Yeah, I just thought I might spend a bit of time just going through how I look at the sort of the social benefits of these areas, and also some of the things that I thought were missing in the draft recommendations. There was a fair amount of work, obviously, on the Aboriginal history, and there are sacred sites, and fair enough, these should be protected. But there's very, very little on European history, which to me sort of staggers me a little bit. If you look at, in my mind, prospecting basically is the backbone to Australia in terms of not only multiculturalism. So places like Melbourne went from 50,000 to basically 500,000 people overnight, became one of the most richest cities in the world, and all these people came from all over the world, and so most of these people stayed, and that was the beginning of multiculturalism in Australia, and basically what we are as Australian today. But not only that, our whole history has been banked on the fact that we have a strong mining and prospecting industry. So it's very, very important factor that was not even discussed. All that was discussed was, there's a few areas that there might be a couple of diggings where someone might have a bit of a scratch. No, there's some fairly fundamental social issues around the fact that you start pulling people out of that, you're fundamentally changing part of the European history and the backbone of what it means to be an Australian. Some of the other sort of social aspects, obviously there's a lot of prospecting clubs that go up there. A lot of these are people that can join these clubs, and it's everyone's welcomed with open arms. And some of these people are not as outgoing as most, so it's great for them to spend that time. They might have a lot of these prospecting clubs have people that are elderly that may have lost a partner and so forth. So it's the strength of these sort of clubs. You minimise these sort of areas, then after a while they find less and less gold, and these clubs start to sort of break down. So, and also the other fact is that we also get a lot more visitors. So this time of year we see a big influx of especially prospectors from Queensland coming down because it's starting to get a bit warm there. Also WA. And also a lot of our international people that come over, because it's where the biggest nuggets in the world have been found, in these sort of areas that they are closing down. You start closing down some areas, then people start asking about other areas, and that's not what we want. I think how that feeds back into the community is really, really important, because you start taking prospectors and the money that they put in, let's say, especially on the weekend, you've probably got 1,000 prospectors out in that area. If each of those are spending $100 a day, that's the reason why some of these small towns have a fuel station, still have a milk bar, still have a bakery. So you take that away, and then the youth don't have the jobs where they can actually learn some of these life skills that they need to have. People have to actually travel further, so it's a greater cost on the local community to get petrol. They have to go to Bendigo or wherever else to actually just fill up the tank. Obviously, that's dangerous driving on country roads and so forth. So, but also it leads to, so if the youth aren't actually getting that experience, what else are they doing? We know there's a large drug issue right across the community, and that even goes into rural areas. So they'll just go and just hang around with their mates and do a couple of bongs and whatever else they're into. So it's really, really, that's important. But also it actually feeds money into that community, which is really, really important, because a lot of these areas are marginal, and we know that there's a lot of issues with depression in some of these areas. So why would you make these more marginalised? Give them less outs. In terms of if their farms aren't going well, they might have other investments in towns and so forth. So it's really, really important as part of a connected community is you just don't just go ahead and make decisions where you can kick a whole community out. Not only a whole community, the prospectors are, as I said, that was the birthplace of multiculturalism in Australia. Yeah, just wanted to just quickly touch on the economics of it. Obviously, there's a lot of money, especially from prospectors, but there's other bush users that go up there into these areas, utilise all of the amenities that are around there, caravan parks, as I said, getting their petrol, all the lovely bakeries up there too, which I quite enjoy. But you take that out of it, and you're basically taking a large chunk of the money that's going into those towns, and that impacts on their economy. But not only that, we've also got supporting industries. So there's a number of prospecting shops throughout this area, but they also rely on other industries. Who makes the coils, Coil Tech, Nugget Finder. Who makes all of the other supporting bits and pieces, the picks and so forth. There's all these little things that you start taking them out, you start taking this money out, and it's not just one industry that suffers. There's a number of industries that actually feed into this. Especially, a lot of us love going out and actually camping out in the bush too. So again, we utilise a lot of camping. Obviously, our cars are also fairly well equipped too, because some of the tracks aren't the greatest and so forth. So we can't necessarily take stands out there. And if we are going out for a while, then we need to have either solar power or even generators. So all forces down into other industries, and that's important. You can't just take things out and expect some sort of growth value because all of a sudden we have some sort of, if you like, potentially more protected area just because no one's actually going in there, when in fact it's probably more fragile because people aren't actually seeing, other people are doing wrong, such as illegal dumping and then also arsonists and so forth. Yeah, just wanted to just finally touch off on some of the environmental issues. So there's a lot of sort of benchmarking that was being done, but to me, again, there's limited studies. So as I said, there's a lot of people that are out there in the bush every weekend. There's a lot of technologies that could actually help these studies. So I'm all for making strong decisions, especially where areas need some sort of protection. But how about providing some good evidence of that? And I suppose some of the frustrating part to me is there's been some mistruths out there. So I know, and this is coming from scientists from the other side saying things such as so prospectors' holes cause weeds to basically seed, and it causes destruction and basically the movement of weeds throughout these natural areas. Well, that's just scientifically untrue. So part of what I do as an environmental scientist, I sort of audit some of the bigger mining companies, and one of the things that especially in deserts, and I'll say in deserts, is you use furrowing and so forth, which, especially with the strong winds and so forth in a desert, captures seeds, and that can actually helps promote the growth, usually of native species, and that's what we want to regrow around some of these larger mining areas in the outback. But how you can compare that to central Victoria is mind-blowing. The only movement of any sort of weeds or introduced species is either from poor mismanagement, especially along roadsides, and like a lot of that just goes back to local government. So that was probably one of the things that was quite shocking, that people actually believe that because we dig a hole and fill it back in, that we're actually promoting weed growth, which is just a total untrue. The other interesting one that I've heard is that apparently that every hole that we dig is about 1 cubic metre. So again, just doing the maths on that, that's roughly around a tonne. So if you consider probably most of prospectors are probably somewhere in the sort of, I don't know, probably 40 to 65. So yeah, maybe early 50s being a midpoint. So I'd like to see anyone in their mid 50s dig a ton of dirt out in rock hard soil with a pick. Apparently we actually go out and do that on a fairly regular basis, and could actually go through 20 to 100 holes. So yeah, digging out 100 tonnes. So I don't know about you, but I haven't seen too many ladies and gentlemen or elderly prospectors, or even prospectors of my ilk, that have got arms like Popeye. So yeah, I think that's really again basically another fallacy that's come through. Probably the other part, again, it gets back to this visibility in the bush. You take users out of there. Sure, there's a little bit of regrowth and so forth in some of these tracks, but what we tend to happen is that we don't have that visibility. People go into the bush, they do things that they shouldn't be doing, legal dumping, and also having arsonists. And as we've seen, especially this fire season, that we can get hot burns. And if this is all about sort of protecting natural capital and the bush, then the last thing that we want to see is hot burns, because the areas just don't recover. It can take 20 or 30 years to get the primary succession and regrowth in those areas. So you actually physically need the people in there, and having that interaction with the bush, and basically making sure we're the protectors too. We don't want to see the bush go up in smoke. We don't want to see people illegally dumping stuff in the bush. We actually go out there to appreciate the bush, as you would have seen on a previous video. Especially prospectors. Prospectors are very, very good geologists, very, very good botanists, but also love the bush and love all of the biodiversity. So we're keen to see that happening, and to actually support that. But you've got to have some more evidence before you can start putting recommendations to shut out such an important, not only part of the users of the bush, but part of the fabric of what it means to be an Australian.